Now that we've built formulas, we're ready to actually calculate the consumer and producer surplus. The way we do that is we're first going to have to find that equilibrium point. Where the supply curve is equal to the demand curve. And then we can evaluate our consumer surplus, which is equal to the integral from 0 to the equilibrium x of the demand curve minus the equilibrium price dx. And we can evaluate our producer surplus, which is equal to the integral from 0 to the equilibrium point of the equilibrium price minus the supply curve dx. So let's take a look at an example of this happening, where the monthly supply and demand curves for a product are given by the functions. Below. We're going to find the equilibrium. We're going to find the consumer surplus. And we're going to find the producer surplus. For our demand curve, the equation is going to be negative 0.01x squared plus 1.74x plus 412.72. And for our supply curve, it's going to be 0.02x squared plus 1.14x minus 206.36. And I want to be careful as we do this problem. Those numbers are kind of ugly, as they often are in real life. Don't get lost in the ugly numbers. Focus on the process, because the process we should be very comfortable with at this point. First, we need to find the equilibrium point where we set the demand and supply curves equal to each other. So let's do that. We'll say the demand curve, negative 0.01x squared plus 1.74x plus 412.72 is equal to 0.02x squared plus 1.14x minus 206.36. Now we know when x squared is involved, we need to move everything to one side. So I'm going to move everything to the right so that the x squareds are positive. When I do that, I'll add 0.01x squared to 0.02x squared. That's going to give me 0.03x squared. Then I'm going to subtract 1.74x from both sides. So 1.14 minus 1.74 is negative 0.6x. And then I'll subtract the 412.72 from both sides. So negative 206.36 minus 412.72 will give me negative 619.08. And to make life easier, I'm going to get rid of these decimals. I'm going to multiply both sides by 100. Because when I multiply everything by 100, we'll get rid of the decimals, giving us 3x squared minus 60x minus 619.08. And even simplifying more, I see that everything there is divisible by 3. So just because smaller numbers are easier to work with, this step is optional, but it makes it easier for me. I'm going to multiply everything by 1/3, and that's going to give me 0 equals x squared minus 20x minus 20,636. Now we're ready to factor this expression. If you can't factor it, you could use the quadratic formula, but I've already factored this in advance to save time. So if you want to use the quadratic formula, you can, but this one turns out it factors to x minus 154 times x plus 134, which gives us values for our x equilibrium point to be either positive 154 or negative 134. Now, obviously, we're not going to produce negative 134 items, so we'll get rid of the negative 134. The x equilibrium price must be 154. To figure out what the p equilibrium price is, we can plug that 154 into either one of our equations. Both will give the same answer because, remember, they're both intersecting at that same point. So let's just plug it into the supply curve, just because I don't like the negative number of the demand curve. So the supply curve at 154 is equal to 0.02 times 154 squared plus 1.14 times 154 minus 206.36, which means the supply curve at 154, if I plug this into my calculator, I think I get 443.52. So what we have shown here then is that at a price of $443.52, there will be 154 items produced. That is our equilibrium point. All right, I've copied the supply and demand formulas on the screen here so we can see everything. But we are ready now to figure out what the consumer surplus is, which is going to be the integral from 0 to the equilibrium number of things, which is 154, of the demand curve, which is negative 0.01x squared plus 1.74x plus 412.72 minus the equilibrium price, which is 443.52. Simplifying that a little bit, we've got the integral from 0 to 154 of negative 0.01x squared plus 1.74x. And then when we do the 412 minus 443, I think we end up with negative 30.8 dx. Don't forget the dx on there. Now we're ready to integrate. When we integrate, we move up to x cubed and divide the negative 0.01 by the new exponent of 3. Plus, increase the exponent to squared. We get 1.74 divided by the new exponent of 2 minus 30.8 x integrated from 0 to 154. Plugging those values in then, we get negative 0.01 over 3 times 154 cubed plus 1.74 over 2 times 154 squared minus 30.8 times 154. And then we have to subtract, plugging the 0 in. But what I want to notice happens here, and I'm not really skipping a step, I'm doing some mental math. When I plug 0 in, 0 cubed is 0, 0 squared is 0, and 0 for the x. When those are multiplied by anything, we get 0. So we're really just subtracting 0. So be very careful. Plugging 0 in does not necessarily mean the answer is 0. It does with a polynomial like this, so it is nice. But just make sure you're not skipping that step if it does actually give you a value. All right, I'm ready to actually just plug that into my calculator then. And when I plug that into my calculator, I think I'm getting a consumer surplus of $3,715.51. All right, if that's the consumer surplus, let's calculate the producer's surplus. Remember, the producer's surplus is that same integral from 0 to 154, but this time we start with the equilibrium price of 443.52. And we subtract, make sure it's in parentheses to show we're subtracting the entire polynomial, not just the first term. We're going to subtract the 0.02x squared plus 1.14x minus 206.36. I don't think my decimal point came over. And that's the equation that we want to evaluate to calculate the producer's surplus. A little bit of simplifying, I'm going to distribute that negative through. When I distribute that negative through, we get 443.52 minus 0.02x squared minus 1.14x. And a negative times a negative is a positive 206.36 dx. Now when I combine like terms with those constants, we'll end up with negative 0.02x squared minus 1.14 2.14x plus, when I add those together, I think I get 649.88 dx. And now that it's simplified, we're ready to integrate, giving us x cubed divided by 3, so negative 0.02 divided by 3, minus, we have x squared, and we take the 1.14 and divide by the 2, plus 649.88 times x, and that's going to integrate from 0 to 154. Plugging those values in, then, we get negative 0.02 over 3 times 154 cubed minus 1.14 over 2 times 154 squared plus 649.88 times 154. And then we're going to subtract off. And again, you notice when we plug the 0 in, we get 0 times something plus 0 times something plus 0 times something. We're just subtracting 0 off of the end. And so when we put this into our calculator, I think we're ending up with a producer's surplus of $62,214.97. And so that's how we can calculate the consumer and producer's surplus. Again, the numbers got kind of ugly because in the real world, the numbers are never pretty. But the process we know. We set up our integral, we subtract top minus bottom, and then just integrate it using our integration rules that we should be very familiar with by this point. It's your turn to practice some of these. Take a look at them on the assignment and let your instructor know if you have any questions.